So Michael Salutin, we were talking about how we were podcasting with Mark, and then once we were done, you introduced yourself as one of his partners, and you started talking about yourself, and I thought it was interesting. And you want to tell me all kinds of stories, and I had to cut you off. I was like, "This is a podcast. I want to talk about it on the podcast." So here we are. So Michael Salutin, is that how you say that?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, let's get a little information on yourself. Tell everybody who you are.
So I'm originally from Canada, and
Ooh,
I've
where in Canada?
lived
Sorry.
I was born in Toronto, and I grew up in Saskatchewan,
Oh.
in Saskatoon, actually.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And I've lived in BC for a while as well. But after that, I lived in Italy, Thailand, and Bahrain in the Middle East. So I've lived a few places, and I'm only kind of recently back to North America, actually. So, yeah. So what do you want to know? I mean, I've been keeping aquariums since I was a kid, and that was my first job, was in aquarium shops. So,
Well, I'm probably gonna peg you as like a pause. I probably shouldn't say I'm gonna peg you, but I'm going to label you as an expert on biotypes and biotopes. It seems as though you had a lot to say before we did the podcast, and I was like, I'm really interested because I find myself being somewheres between a biotope and a fish keeper hobbyist, where I like them to have something that makes sense for the actual fish that we're keeping, as opposed to what a lot of people do is set up an aquarium that's
for themselves.
well, yeah, that's very aesthetically pleasing
Yeah.
and rule of thirds and all that stuff. And
Yeah.
when you do go, so let's get a definition of what you believe a biotype is. Are you familiar with like
Okay.
biotypes and biotopes?
So, I mean, we use the word biotope. I'm not actually that happy with that word sometimes. I don't think that what we do with aquariums are biotopes. I think they should be called ecotopes, which is a little bit more specific than a biotope. So, a biotope is the definition of a biotope in the wild is like an area that's uniform habitat, right? So, it could be like a section of a river where certain fish, plants, and conditions occur, or it could be the middle of the river. There's many different biotopes, but it's an area that you will find, only specific plants, animals, and even geology and so on in that place, that specific place. And to me, biotopes are actually a little bit too big to reproduce in captivity. For the most part, you would need a public aquarium to do that. But what you can reproduce are called ecotopes. So that's what most people think of as an actual biotope, which is a real small zoom in of a biotope, where you have like a little section of the marginal plants, say on a stream, in a black water, in a specific part of near Letitia, near the Amazon, right? Some very specific location.
Yeah. So you use the
that you can
exact
kind of
the
recreate.
exact plants, the exact fish, the exact substrate, everything from that
Yeah,
little
so,
sliver.
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah,
That's why I don't
a
think they
little
can exist in
sliver.
an aquarium because they just don't.
Yeah.
I'm like, you can get close.
I mean, so this is the point. Like, I've been I've been the judge, one of the judges for the Biotope Aquarium Design Contest for the past 10 years, which has been more and more successful. I think every year more and more people, hundreds and hundreds of people, try to recreate these very specific habitats, and they go out of their way to research them. They even go to the habitats, like sometimes where they live, if it's in Argentina or something, they go to that river, they photograph it. They photograph it underwater. They get the exact species that are only found there. So those are the real purists. But you don't have to be in the country to do it. You just have to have some good video footage, some good information on the biotope, and then you try to recreate it as faithfully in captivity as possible. So it's a lot of different things coming together. There's the aesthetics, and then there's the kind of biology and unique sort of evolution that's occurred in that place, and then there's the realistic appearance of the place. And then there's a sort of educational aspect, like a lot of people never seen that place before, right? Underwater. So now you know that this place exists, and you can talk about if that place is threatened, if that place, is vulnerable. And to be honest, like these freshwater habitats, they don't get a lot of attention especially compared to marine. People just don't know they exist. They don't know what's beneath the surface of these places.
Well, there is a lot of conservation in the coral industry and in the saltwater side of things. There's a little bit in the freshwater, but not worldwide like coral, and saving all of these reefs. I mean, all of these natural habitats a lot of them are under threat due to humans.
Yeah.
Either irresponsibly fishing, deforestation, dams. Dams are a huge one. That'll wipe out an entire species. All of these things that we are specifically doing. And now, one of the things that always bothered me was like, and it's one tiny little thing that bothers me, and it's a massive conversation, but when some people complain that aquarium keepers, people in the hobby shouldn't have them because we're wiping them out in the wild. And it's not necessarily factual or true. At times, once we get our hands on them, we'll breed them in numbers that can sustain the hobby. And what is your idea? What is your thoughts on wild caught versus captive bred? Are you against either one, or for one more so, or?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a complex question, and this is something I love it when people ask me, because I get to tell them what I know about it, which is that there are wild-caught species that are overfished. There are other wild-caught species that can be sustainably caught.
Yeah.
There are very bad captive breeding operations that lead to very weak fish and very bad conditions, and there are great captive breeding efforts. So there is no one, size fits all for this. There are different conservation projects out there to sustainably catch wild-caught fish and help sustain local peoples so that they're not cutting down trees. There's that program, buy a fish, save a tree. Now, how well is it working? I don't know, but the concept is very good. And then there are other fish that need to be bred in captivity because otherwise they would get over collected in the wild. But one thing I've noticed, all these people who come and say, first of all, there's an animal rights side. It's cruel to keep fish at all. Like, you shouldn't keep them at all. And then there's the whole thing like, they would be in the wild so happy if it wasn't for you, and they're going extinct because they're being caught. Well, for the most part, that's simply not true. The destructive things that are going on out there, actually, a lot of the only people who cared about them are aquarists.
Yeah.
Even if it's for selfish reasons, like we want to have those cool-looking fish, and we don't want them to disappear because we like to have them in our aquariums. But I mean, there was a guy in Toronto, I have to look him up, but he single-handedly saved several species of rare Mexican live bears because no one else cared. Honestly, like at that time, no conservation organization cared. He just kept them in his basement, thousands of them, and bred them for like 20 years. Now they're actually reintroducing them to some lakes and things that have been restored. He's single-handedly saved like half a dozen species just because he cared enough to do it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be said for that, I think. And
Do you think nobody cares about Mexican live bears because they're not that pretty?
See, this is the thing, right? They're not the big showy fish either, right? They're just little guys. They're gonna get forgotten and extincted, basically, right? Just out of sheer neglect.
Well,
right?
if they're not fishing for them and doing it responsibly, where is that entire what's that word? That entire industry going to go? How are they going to feed their families in those Amazonian countries?
This is what I'm so interested in now. There are some efforts out there, and they need to be stepped up so much. Conservation has to be integrated with local economy, and that might be a really good way to do it. But it has to get funding, it has to get support, and it has to get knowledge out there, because a lot of people, they don't even know where the fish come from. They're like, yeah, the fish are out there somewhere in the water, and people catch them. Like, it's so much more complex than that, right? And so you have to get out there and educate. And I mean, that's something I hope to do, and something I hope that the biotope contests, and at some point I hope NDS as well, can help to educate, get that word out there to the right people, that these habitats are that they exist, first of all, that they're beautiful and interesting and they have a lot of biodiversity, and that they're worth saving. And that saving doesn't just mean throw money at it. You have to have the local people have to be involved. They have to have a stake in it, and it's probably an economic stake, and it has to be sustainable. So that involves a lot of different things. It involves some wild caught in certain seasons with certain fish.
Yeah.
It involves some captive breeding with certain fish. It involves relationships with suppliers and not having a sort of reduction in fisheries.
Well, there's a lot of fish
like
that just
we have.
don't, once we do get a hold of them in the hobby, first and foremost, we'll water them down so they look nothing like their wild counterparts, or they're
Right.
missing certain iridescence and colorations that you don't see, especially it's very rampant in tetras. They lose a tremendous amount of their coloration once we get them into captive breeding and captive raising, which we do need to have wild-caught blood, but, like you said, there's so many different arguments and so many different ways to come at this. You can't just say, I'm against wild caught or I'm against one thing or another. Because, so imagine banning the importation, which is already being, it's already being governed, especially with stingrays.
Yeah.
There's certain amounts that you're allowed to export from South America every year. Obviously, not everybody's following the rules. But if we take away that, those people that are feeding their families doing it this way, they're going to go find another way, which a lot of the times one of the most popular industries down there is deforestation.
Yeah.
And,
There's deforestation, there's gold mining, there's loads of things, and they're very, very destructive. They're much more destructive than catching a few fish and selling them.
Yeah.
So these people making these rules, they think that they're doing it and they mean well, but it's just they don't understand the full picture.
Yeah.
I think
So
a lot of
this
the
is-
times the government surrounds themselves with people that have no clue what they're talking
Yeah,
about.
all the time.
And a lot of the times they'll base decisions off of warm fuzzy feelings and how the general public will perceive this decision,
Exactly.
as opposed to having a properly educated
plan.
having all the information that they
Yeah.
need and require. But very rarely does the government involve anybody that actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to the aquarium hobby, and because it's just a fish.